The morning Mamie Doyle dropped 3 full sacks of grain in the middle of Caldwell's Main Street and stood there with her hands bleeding and her jaw set so tight it could crack stone. She had no idea that the tall stranger watching from across the road would become the most important person in her life. It was the spring of 1882, and Caldwell, Kansas was a town that did not wait for anyone to catch their breath. The cattle drives pushed through in waves, the saloons never truly quieted, and the dust that rose from the street seemed to carry within it the weight of every hard story this part of the country had ever produced. Mamie Doyle had her own hard story, and she carried it the same way she carried everything else, quietly, stubbornly, and with a determination that bordered on recklessness. She was 23 years old. She had her mother's dark auburn hair and her father's gray eyes, and she had the kind of face that would have been called beautiful if anyone had taken long enough to look at it, which not many people did, because when you were hauling grain sacks and splitting your own wood and keeping a leaking roof above your head, beauty was not something that entered the conversation very often. 2 years ago, both her parents had been taken by a fever that swept through their small homestead outside of town. It had been fast, merciless, and complete. Her father went first, then her mother 4 days later, and Mamie had stood at 2 fresh graves with her 12-year-old sister Clara pressed into her left side and her 9-year-old sister June pressed into her right, and she had made a decision so quiet and so absolute that it required no words at all. She was not going to let them go. She was not going to send them to an aunt in St. Louis they barely knew, or to some church organization that would separate them, or to any other fate that meant breaking apart the only family she had left. So she had stayed. She had taken over the homestead. She had learned what she had not already learned about the garden, the chickens, the cow, the fence lines, the well, the wood pile, the roof, the accounts at the general store, and the particular way you had to talk to Mr. Harlow at the bank when the payment was 3 weeks late, which it almost always was. 2 years of that. 2 years of sunrise before dawn and work until the candle burned down. 2 years of stretching every penny until it nearly tore. 2 years of being the mother and the sister and the father and the farmhand all at once because there was no one else. Clara was 14 now and worked beside her without complaint. June was 11 and more sunshine than shadow, which Mamie clung to on the bad days. They were fed. They were clothed. They were in school when the season permitted. They were loved deeply and completely and without reservation. But today, the grain sacks had won. Mamie had loaded them herself at the mill on the eastern edge of town. 3 50-pound sacks, which was more than she should have taken on without a wagon. But the wagon wheel had cracked 2 days ago, and she had not yet gotten it repaired, and the grain was needed at home. She had managed 2 blocks before the rope holding the sacks together had simply given out, and all 3 had hit the street with a sound like small cannon fire, and the top one had split, and now a thin river of grain was running between the ruts in the road. She stood looking at it, and for just one moment, just one single breath of a moment, she allowed herself to feel exactly how tired she was. Not physically, though her back and arms were aching. The deeper kind of tired. The kind that lived in the bones. Then she reached down and grabbed the split sack, planning to fold what remained of it over and attempt to salvage what she could and drag the others to the side of the road and figure out the rest. "Let me help you carry that." The voice was low and even, not loud, not performing itself. She looked up. He was standing just a few feet away, and she had not heard him cross the street, which told her he was either very quiet or she had been more lost in her own head than she realized. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, with the kind of build that came from actual work and not just the favorable arrangement of bones. He wore a brown hat that had seen considerable weather, a plain shirt and worn but well-kept boots. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved and then reconsidered, dark brown eyes, and a very faint scar along his chin that she would later learn came from a fence post and not anything dramatic. He was looking at her without pity, which she appreciated, but without indifference either. He was looking at her like a person looks at a problem they genuinely intend to solve. "I can manage," she said, because she always said that. "I don't doubt it," he said, and he said it with such straightforward sincerity that she did not feel dismissed or patronized. "But I've got 2 good arms and nowhere pressing to be, and that sack is going to lose the rest of its grain before you get it tied off." He was right about the sack. She looked at him for another half-second, reading him the way you had to read people in a place like Caldwell, where a man's intentions were not always what his expression suggested. He met her gaze directly. He did not look away, but he did not push either. He simply waited. "All right," she said. He crouched beside the split sack and produced a length of rope from his belt, the kind of man who carried spare rope as a matter of course, and tied off the torn end with a knot she had never seen before but that held perfectly. Then he lifted 2 of the sacks like they were filled with feathers and looked at her, clearly waiting to see which direction she intended to go. "The homestead is a mile out along the northern road," she said, slightly wrong-footed by how efficient he had been. "Lead the way," he said. She picked up the 3rd sack, the lightest of the 3, and started walking, and he fell into step beside her, and that was how it began. His name was Noah Fairchild, and he was 26 years old. He had been working cattle drives since he was 16, had come up through Texas and spent 3 years on the Kishom Trail, and had arrived in Caldwell 2 weeks before with a small string of horses he intended to sell and no particular plan for what came after. He told her some of this as they walked, not in the way a man talks to fill silence, but in the way a person talks when they are actually interested in the exchange and willing to contribute their fair share to it. She told him very little. She said her name. She said she had a homestead. She said she had sisters. She did not say how long she had been managing alone, because that felt like information she was not yet ready to hand over to a stranger on a road. But he did not press. He asked about the land, about the grain, about what she was growing this season, and his questions were the questions of someone who understood farming, and not someone making conversation for its own sake. She found herself answering more fully than she intended. When they reached the homestead, Clara was in the garden and June was chasing one of the chickens around the yard, with the focused intensity that only an 11-year-old could bring to chicken chasing. The place was modest, a solid enough house that needed paint and a new window shutter, a barn that was functional if not beautiful, a garden that was clearly well tended, and a yard where things had been mended and repaired with more ingenuity than resources. Clara looked up from the garden and studied the stranger with 14-year-old directness. "Who is he?" she asked Mamie. "Noah Fairchild," he said, answering for himself with an easiness that Clara seemed to find acceptable. "I helped carry the grain." "The wagon wheel is still broken," Clara told him, as though this were relevant information she thought he should have. "Clara," Mamie said, "what it is?" June had abandoned the chicken and was now standing about 4 feet from Noah, looking up at him with open curiosity. "You are very tall," she said. "I've been told that," he agreed. "Our pa was tall," June said. Then, as though this were a natural progression of thought, "he died." "June," Mamie said quietly. "I'm sorry to hear that," Noah said, and he said it simply, not with the excessive careful sorrow that adults sometimes performed around children when the subject of death arose, but with genuine steadiness. June seemed satisfied by this. She nodded and went back to the chicken. Noah set the grain sacks down where Mamie directed, just inside the barn door. She thanked him. He touched his hat. She expected him to leave. "The wagon wheel," he said instead. "May I look at it?" "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. He looked at the wagon sitting to the side of the barn with one wheel propped against it. "I'd like to if it's all right with you." She stood there for a moment and something shifted very slightly in the tightness that lived behind her sternum. Not enough to mean anything, she told herself. Just a slight easing. "It's all right with me," she said. He spent the better part of an hour with that wheel, while Mamie stored the grain and Clara finished the garden, and June eventually caught the chicken. He worked quietly and methodically, and when she brought him a cup of water he thanked her and drank it and went back to the wheel without making a production of either the gratitude or the work. By the time the afternoon light had begun to slope toward gold, The wheel was back on the wagon and in better condition than it had been before it cracked. He gathered his tools, such as they were, and put on his hat. "Thank you," Mamie said, and she meant it in a way that was harder to say than the simple 2 words suggested. "It was no trouble," he said. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was careful and warm at the same time, like a man who knew exactly what he wanted to say and was deciding whether this was the moment to say it. It was not the moment. He seemed to understand that. He touched his hat again and walked back toward the road. She watched him go until the bend in the road took him, and then she stood there for a moment longer before Clara appeared beside her. "He fixed the wheel," Clara said. "I saw." "Are you going to see him again?" "Clara, I'm just asking." Mamie turned and went back inside, but the question stayed with her longer than she intended. She saw him again 3 days later at the general store. He was buying coffee and a new length of rope, and she was buying flour and trying to make the store's account stretch to cover the sugar that June had been carefully not asking about for 2 weeks. He saw her before she saw him, and when she turned from the shelves and found him standing a few feet away, there was an expression on his face that was briefly unguarded, something pleased and warm that he reined in with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to keep his own counsel. "Miss Doyle," he said. "Mr. Fairchild," she said. There was a pause that could have been awkward but somehow was not. "How is the wagon wheel holding?" He asked. "Perfectly. I was going to stop at the livery yesterday and had no trouble at all." "Good," he said, and he smiled. It was not a broad smile, not the kind that announces itself loudly. It was the kind that starts at the corners and moves inward, and it changed his whole face in a way that she was annoyed to find she could not stop noticing. They ended up walking out of the store at the same time, and then somehow walking in the same direction down the main street, and she did not exactly know how she came to be telling him about the fence line on the eastern side of the property that she had been meaning to repair since the autumn. It was not something she told people about. It was not something she advertised, the endless list of repairs and tasks that were always one step ahead of her, but he listened in a way that made it feel less like a list of failures and more like a conversation about practical matters between practical people. "I'll be here through the end of the month at least," he said. "I'd be glad to help with the fence if you'd let me." She stopped walking. She turned to look at him and said, very directly, "Mr. Fairchild, why?" He seemed to consider the question seriously, which she appreciated. He did not laugh it off or give her a smooth answer. "Because you are clearly managing a great deal on your own," he said. "And because I have the time and the ability to be useful, and because—" he paused, and there was something in the pause that was honest and slightly undefended, "I would like to." She held his gaze for a moment. He did not look away. "All right," she said again, and later she would think that those 2 words were what kept starting everything. He came to help with the fence that Saturday. Clara was there and watched him work with thoughtful eyes. June brought him a cup of water without being asked, which was not something June did for just anyone. Mamie worked alongside him, because she was not a woman who stood back and supervised, and they worked well together in a way she had not expected, finding a rhythm without discussion, anticipating each other's movements, not needing to fill every quiet with words. By the end of the day, the eastern fence line was in better shape than it had been in 2 years, and the 3 of them ate supper together at the outdoor table, while the evening settled in around them, purple and warm, and Noah told June the story of a particularly stubborn longhorn bull he had once spent 3 hours chasing across a Texas plain, and June laughed so hard she nearly tipped over her bench, and Clara smiled in the careful way of someone older than her years. And Mamie watched all of it from across the table and felt something dangerous beginning to warm in her chest. After supper, after June had been coaxed inside and Clara had taken herself to bed with a book, Mamie walked Noah to the road. The stars were out in the enormous way they got over the Kansas plain, thick and close, and the night smelled of grass and wood smoke. "You are good with them," she said, meaning Clara and June because it needed to be said. "They are easy to be good with," he said. He looked at her in the starlight with that careful, warm expression and said, "How long has it been since your parents?" She looked out at the dark field for a moment. 2 years in February. That's a long time to carry things alone. It is what it was, she said, which was the most she allowed herself in that direction. Yes, he said, but it doesn't have to stay that way. She looked at him then. He was not saying it with any pushiness, not with the kind of manufactured sentiment that men sometimes performed when they wanted something. He was saying it the way he said everything, level and honest and meant. "Good night, Mr. Fairchild," she said. "Good night, Miss Doyle," he said, and walked off into the dark. She stood there until she could not hear his footsteps anymore, and then she stood there a little longer. Over the next 3 weeks, Noah Fairchild became a presence in her days that was so natural and unforced that it was genuinely difficult to pinpoint how it had happened. He was not underfoot. He was not presumptuous. He came when she needed help with something specific and was useful in direct and practical ways. He sold his horses, which went well, and found short-term work helping break horses at a ranch outside of town, which gave him income and kept him in Caldwell without making him a burden on anyone. He ate supper at the homestead twice a week, and Clara had stopped watching him with that careful, assessing look, and had started simply talking to him the way she talked to people she had decided she trusted, which was not something Clara did quickly. June had taken to saving interesting rocks to show him, which was one of June's highest forms of regard. Mamie noticed all of this. She also noticed the way her day had begun to feel different on the mornings when she knew he was coming over, a kind of lightness that she did not trust but could not quite bring herself to push away. She noticed the way she had started thinking about what she would say to him about things, storing up observations during the day to share later the way you stored up provisions for winter. She noticed that when their hands brushed passing tools or water cups or any of the thousand small objects of daily work, she did not pull away as fast as she once would have. What she was not prepared for was the evening Mrs. Prentice stopped her outside the church on a Sunday and gave her a look full of knowing warmth and said, "That young man of yours is a fine one, Mamie." "He is not my young man," Mamie said. "Of course," said Mrs. Prentice, with the tone of someone who intended no such thing. Mamie went home and was sharp with herself about it for the rest of the afternoon. She was practical. She was responsible. She had 2 sisters who depended on her entirely, and a homestead that demanded every resource she had, and a life that did not have room in it for the kind of foolishness that Mrs. Prentice was implying. She was still thinking about this when Noah arrived that Tuesday evening to help repair the roof section above the kitchen that had begun to leak again with the spring rains. She was quiet while they worked, which was not entirely unusual, but there was a tension in her silence that she knew he noticed. When they came down off the roof and the work was done and she was standing at the pump washing the grime from her hands, he said very simply, "Something is bothering you." "Nothing is bothering me," she said. "All right," he said, and he did not push, which was somehow worse than if he had. She dried her hands and turned to face him. "Do you know what people in town are saying?" His expression did not change very much, but she could see him calibrating. About us. About the fact that you are here frequently." She said it flatly, not as an accusation, just as the fact that it was. He looked at her for a moment. "What are they saying?" "That you are my young man." "Ah," he said. A pause. "Is that what's bothering you? What they're saying, or something else?" It was the way he asked it, quiet and direct and without any defensive sharpness, that undid the tight knot she had spent 3 days winding herself into. "Noah," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. She saw his expression go still in a way that was different from its usual stillness. "I have 2 sisters. I have a homestead that is one bad season away from difficulty. I am not in a position to be careless." "I know that," he said. "I cannot afford to get turned around on something that turns out to be nothing." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him. He looked back, and his expression was open in a way she had not quite seen before, open and a little careful, like something he was choosing to show her. "It is not nothing," he said. Not to me. I want you to know that. I am not here because I have nowhere else to be. I am here because I want to be here, because of you, because of those girls. Because this, he gestured, and the gesture took in the homestead and the evening and the whole accumulation of days they had spent in each other's company, means something to me. She stood very still. I am not asking you for anything you're not ready to give, he said. I'm just asking you to know that I'm not going anywhere. The evening was still around them. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shuffled. That is a large thing to say, she said finally. Yes, he said, it is. She turned back to the house because she needed a moment, and she said over her shoulder, "Stay for supper." Yes, he said again, and she could hear the warmth in the single word. It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. But it was something. And Mamie Doyle, who had spent 2 years being practical and deliberate and careful about everything, allowed herself to hold it. The weeks rolled on, and the thing between them deepened in the unhurried way of something genuine, in the way of water finding its level. It was not dramatic in the conventional sense. There were no grand speeches under moonlit skies, though there was more moonlight than she had noticed in a long time. It was made of small things. It was made of the mornings he arrived with an extra sack of coffee because he had noticed hers was running low. It was made of the afternoons when he taught Clara how to properly mend a bridle, sitting patient and clear-eyed while she asked 47 questions. It was made of the evenings when June fell asleep against his arm at the supper table, and he sat very still so as not to wake her. It was made of the conversations they had when the girls were in bed, and the two of them sat on the porch in the late evening air, talking about things they had not talked about with many other people. He told her about growing up in East Texas, about a father who was more absence than presence, about learning to work cattle as a way of building something solid when there was not much solid ground available. She told him carefully at first and then less carefully about what the 2 years had been like. About the night her mother died and she had sat in the dark kitchen with her 2 sisters asleep in the next room and understood completely the scale of what was now hers to do. About the fear she had learned to fold up small enough to carry without it crippling her. About the pride, too, the real deep pride in what she had built and maintained and held together. He listened the way he always listened, fully and without inserting himself, and when she finished he said, "You are remarkable, Mamie." She shook her head. "I just did what needed doing." "That is exactly what makes a person remarkable," he said. She looked at him in the porch light and the night, and she thought that she might be in love with him, and the thought was terrifying and clarifying and true. She did not say it, not that night, but she stopped arguing with herself about it. The trouble came in June, which was perhaps appropriate given that trouble and June often arrived around the same time, though in this case the trouble was not the 11-year-old June, but rather a man named Dobbins who had been trying to acquire the Doyle homestead by persuasion, and then by pressure for the better part of a year. Harlan Dobbins was not a villainous man in the storybook sense. He was a land speculator in the straightforward, practical sense of that term. He bought land cheap, held it or sold it at profit, and understood that the homestead he wanted sat at the corner of a section he was assembling for sale to a cattle operation that would pay him considerably more than he would pay for any individual piece. He was not cruel. He was simply entirely indifferent to the fact that the land he wanted was the home of 3 people who had no other home. He came to the homestead on a Tuesday afternoon while Noah was in town. He came with his lawyer, a thin, pale man named Eddings who wore a suit that was too heavy for the June heat and sweated visibly throughout the conversation, and he came with an offer that was technically reasonable and practically impossible. Mamie stood on her porch and listened to the full offer, which amounted to a purchase price that would, as Dobbins explained carefully, give her and her sisters a comfortable start somewhere else. "I am not interested in a start somewhere else," Mamie said. "Miss Doyle," Dobbins said, and he had the practiced reasonable tone of a man who expected eventually to get what he wanted, "I understand your attachment to the property. but you are a young woman with considerable responsibilities, and the offer I'm making is more than fair. You could take your sisters someplace with better prospects. This is my home, Mamie said. My parents are buried on this land. I built what is here with my own hands and my sister's hands, and I am not selling it. Dobbins sighed in the patient way of someone who has had this conversation before. The offer has a time limit, he said. I'll be back in 3 weeks. I hope you'll reconsider. He tipped his hat, and he and the sweating lawyer climbed back into their buggy and drove away. Mamie stood on the porch after they left and breathed steadily until the shake in her hand stopped. Clara appeared in the doorway behind her. What did they want? To buy our home, Mamie said. Clara's jaw set in an expression that was so much like Mamie's own that it nearly made her smile even now. We are not selling. No, Mamie agreed. We are not, she told Noah that evening. She had been uncertain whether to tell him at all because the instinct to manage her own problems was deeply ingrained by 2 years of practice. But she was learning, slowly and somewhat painfully, that allowing Noah to know about her difficulties was not the same as being unable to handle them, and keeping him at arm's length from the real things in her life was its own kind of dishonesty. He listened to the whole account without interrupting. When she finished, there was a period of quiet. Do you know what his legal standing is? He asked. Whether he can compel a sale somehow. I don't know, she admitted. Eddings kept referencing some tax matter. I don't fully understand it. There's a man at the land office in town, Carlo. He is straight dealing. I'll speak to him tomorrow if that's all right with you. It's all right with me, she said. He went to see Carlo the next morning. The news was not catastrophic, but it was not simple either. There was indeed a small, outstanding tax assessment on the property from the previous year, one that Mamie had not known about because the notice had been sent to a town, address her father had used that no longer received her mail. It was not large enough to constitute a legal mechanism for forced sale, but Dobbins had apparently been buying up similar small assessments across the territory and using them as leverage in negotiations. It was not illegal, exactly. It was the kind of thing that was possible because the people it was done to did not have lawyers of their own. Noah paid the tax assessment from his own money before Mamie knew he had done it. She found out when she went to the land office herself the following day to understand her position, and Carlo told her, with careful neutrality, that the assessment had been settled 2 days prior by a Mr. Noah Fairchild on her behalf. She drove the wagon home in a particular silence that was not the comfortable kind. He was working on the fence on the southern end of the property when she arrived, and he looked up when he heard the wagon and then read something in her expression and straightened slowly. You paid it, she said. Yes, he said, without asking me. Yes, he said again. He met her gaze steadily and did not try to make it smaller than it was. I should have asked you first. I knew you would want to, and I knew you would tell me not to, and I acted ahead of the conversation. That was not right. She stood with her hands at her sides and the frustration and the gratitude and something else, something fuller, all pressing at the same place in her chest. Noah, she said. I know, he said. He took 2 steps toward her and his voice was quiet and direct. I know you can manage everything yourself. I have never doubted that, not for 1 minute. I didn't want you to have to, not this time, not if I could stop it. She looked at him, and the thing that was pressing in her chest pressed harder. You cannot just do things like that, she said, but the edge was gone from her voice. I know, he said. Tell me what I can do and I will do it that way, but tell me I can keep helping. Tell me I can stay. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had walked across a street to help her carry grain sacks, and had stayed for fences and roofs and grain runs and suppers and long porch evenings, and who had paid her tax assessment without permission because he did not want her to carry that either. You can stay, she said. He exhaled, and the relief in it was so real and unguarded that something in her finally let go of the last wall she had been maintaining. Noah, she said again, and then she crossed the remaining distance between them and he met her halfway, and she put her face against his chest, and he put his arms around her, and they stood there in the June afternoon with the fence stretching out around them and the whole Kansas sky overhead. "I love you," she said, into his shirt, muffled and a little mortifying and completely true. His arms tightened. He pressed his mouth against the top of her head. "I have loved you since you told me you could manage and clearly needed someone to argue with you about it," he said, and she laughed, and the laugh surprised her. She tipped her head up and looked at him, and he looked back with his whole unguarded face, and she thought, this is it. This is the real thing. He kissed her then, carefully and then not carefully, and the afternoon held still around them. When they walked back toward the house, Clara was standing in the garden watching them with an expression of profound satisfaction. "Finally," she said. "Clara," Mamie said. "What? June owes me a nickel." Clara turned back to her weeding with enormous serenity. Mamie looked at Noah. He was trying not to smile. "They bet on us," she said. "Good odds," he said. Dobbins came back at the end of his 3 weeks to find that his leverage had been removed. He made his offer again, and again Mamie declined it on her porch with the same quiet absoluteness she had used the first time. He stood for a moment assessing her, and then he looked at Noah standing in the yard behind her, and he appeared to make several calculations simultaneously. "The tax matter was settled," he said. "Entirely," Mamie said. Another pause. "The offer stands if you change your mind," he said, and this time there was less certainty behind it. "I will not change my mind," Mamie said. "This is my home." He drove away, and this time she had the strong sense that he would not come back, and she was right. He did not. That evening Noah came to the porch where she was sitting in the last of the light and sat beside her, close, their shoulders touching. "What happens now?" she asked. "With Dobbins?" "With everything," she said, and she meant it broadly, and he understood her. He turned to look at her. "That depends on you, Mamie. I have been thinking about it, and I will say this once plainly and then wait." He paused. "I do not want to go back to being a man who moves from one cattle drive to the next, living out of a bedroll. I haven't wanted that since about 10 minutes into the first day I spent here. I want to be here. I want to work this land with you. I want to be someone your sisters can count on. And I want to ask you to marry me if you will have me, but I am asking as someone who intends to earn the place rather than assume it." Mamie was quiet for so long that he began to look uncertain, which was rare enough to be striking. "I have been managing alone for 2 years," she said at last. "I know," he said. "I am not good at accepting help. I have noticed that. And I have 2 sisters who are my first responsibility, always. I know that too. I would not have it any other way." She looked at him in the evening light, at his earnest face and his steady eyes, at the man who had picked up her grain sacks and stayed to fix her wagon wheel and replaced her fence posts and paid her tax assessment and held her sisters' hearts with such naturalness and care. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you." She looked at him with something that was not quite amusement but was close to it. "I have been in love with you since at least April. I've just been taking my time about saying it in a useful direction." He laughed, and it was the fullest laugh she had heard from him, and it was wonderful. They were married in August of 1882, in the little white church on the southern edge of Caldwell, on a Saturday morning when the sky was the particular clear blue of late summer, and the heat was dry and clean rather than oppressive. Mamie wore her mother's altered wedding dress, which Clara had spent 3 evenings altering with skill that impressed everyone who saw it. June threw flower petals with the total commitment of someone for whom this was the greatest event in recorded history. The ceremony was small and genuine. The minister said the words and they said theirs, and when Noah slid the ring onto her finger, plain gold, well made, bought from the jeweler on Main Street with money he had put aside, his hands were absolutely steady, and she thought that steadiness was perhaps the thing she loved most about him. Afterward there was a supper at the homestead with the neighbors who had become something like family over the years, Mrs. Prentice and her husband, the Carlyles from the land office, a handful of others. The long table was set outside and the evening came in gently, and June danced to the fiddle music someone had arranged until she finally dropped into a chair and fell asleep with a smile still on her face. Clara stood beside Mamie at one point in the evening and said, without looking at her, "I'm glad." "I know," Mamie said. "He is good," Clara said. "He is actually good." "Yes," Mamie said. "He is." Clara nodded once, satisfied, and went to get more pie. That night, after the guests had gone and June was carried to bed and Clara had retreated to her room with characteristic self-sufficiency, Mamie and Noah sat on the porch in the marriage quiet of their first night, and it was comfortable and full and right. "I was afraid," she told him, for no particular reason other than that it was true and she wanted him to know it. "Of marrying me. Of wanting to," she said. "Of letting something matter so much again. After my parents. It is hard when you lose the people who were supposed to be permanent." He took her hand. He did not say anything immediately, because he understood that sometimes the truest response to a true thing was just to be present with it. Then he said, "I'm not going anywhere. You said that before. I will keep saying it." She leaned against him and looked out at the dark field and the bright stars and the land that was hers and now his and had been her parents' before that, and she felt, for the first time in 2 years, something that was not just the absence of fear. She felt full. The autumn came with its work, which was considerable, but now there were 2 pairs of hands for most of it, and that made a different world entirely. Noah worked the land with a quiet skill that expanded into genuine expertise as the seasons went on. He was not a farmer by original training, but he was a meticulous learner, and he applied the same unhurried thoroughness to the soil that he applied to everything else. The homestead began, slowly and incrementally, to look like a place that was being maintained rather than desperately preserved. He built Clara a proper workbench in the barn, where she had been trying to learn woodworking with increasingly impressive results, and he spent Sunday afternoons teaching June to ride, which turned out to be one of the better decisions anyone had made in some time, because June on horseback was an absolute natural, and the look on her face in the saddle was the look of someone who had found the thing they were meant to do. Mamie watched all of this and allowed herself, gradually, to believe in it. In December, she found out she was expecting. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told Noah, not because she did not want to, but because she was processing the enormity of it, the way it rearranged the horizon of the future she had been building in her mind. She had been so focused for so long on holding what was there that she had not quite looked as far ahead as new. She told him on a cold evening when the girls were in bed and the fire was burning low and the house was warm and their own. He went very still when she told him, the way he went still when he was genuinely moved. Then he looked at her with an expression so open and undefended that she felt the last of her own defenses simply exhale. "Mamie," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like something he had been keeping carefully. "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could see that he was. "I am." He stopped, tried again. "I have spent most of my life not being entirely sure I belonged anywhere, and now I am sitting in my own house with my wife and she is telling me we are going to have a child. There are no words for what I am." She moved to sit beside him and he put his arm around her and she put her head on his shoulder, and they sat with the fire and the winter outside and the life building inside her, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Clara, when told, looked briefly like she was going to cry, which she covered immediately with practicality. "We will need to expand the sleeping arrangements," she said. "I have some ideas." "Of course you do," Mamie said fondly. June simply threw herself at Mamie and held on for a very long time without saying anything, and that said more than she could have put into words. The pregnancy proceeded without drama, which Mamie was grateful for, because the work of the homestead did not pause for it. She was sensible and she was stubborn, which meant she reduced her heavier tasks by approximately 20% and redirected Noah's considerable energy toward those same tasks, which he accepted without comment and generally got done faster than she would have anyway, not that she said so. The baby arrived in September of 1883, at the very end of a warm day, with the golden light of early autumn coming through the window. He was a boy, which surprised no one who had been watching Mamie carry him for 8 months, and Noah held him with the same steady hands he applied to everything, and looked at him with an expression that Mamie would remember for the rest of her life. They named him James, after no one in particular and both of their fathers in spirit. He was loud and healthy and enormous for a newborn, and June was so enchanted by him that she had to be gently redirected from picking him up at all hours. Clara, who was 16 by then, and had grown into someone remarkable, steady, and intelligent and quietly fierce, held James on the second day with such careful tenderness that Mamie had to look away for a moment. "He is very small," Clara said. "He is actually quite large for a newborn," Mamie said. "He seems small," Clara said firmly, and held him tighter. The years that followed were the years of a life being built in earnest, and they were not without their difficulties because no real life is without them. But they were full and grounded and threaded through with a happiness that was not the delicate kind but the sturdy kind, the kind that holds up under weather. The homestead grew. Noah expanded the barn the winter after James was born, and the following spring they added 10 more acres to their planting, which required more work than they had originally estimated and produced a harvest that made the extra work entirely worthwhile. He had a particular skill with horses that had not gone to waste. He began taking in horses for training on a small scale, boarding and breaking and selling, and that additional income changed the arithmetic of their finances in material ways. Mamie kept the books with a precision she had always had and channeled into something more than survival. She had always been good with numbers, and now she was good with numbers in a way that was building towards something instead of just holding the line against loss. By the end of 1884, the outstanding account at the general store was not just manageable but small, and by the middle of 1885 it was settled entirely. She paid the last of it on a Wednesday afternoon and walked out of the store into the bright Kansas sunshine and stood there for a moment, and what she felt was not triumphant, exactly. It was quieter than triumph. It was more like the feeling of a door that had always been slightly ajar clicking closed at last. Clara turned 17 and then 18, and the girl who had assessed Noah Fairchild with 14-year-old gravity across a garden row became the young woman who read every book she could get her hands on and who had begun, quietly and methodically, to pursue the idea of attending the normal school in Emporia to become a teacher. It was not an easy aspiration in 1885 for a young woman without considerable resources, but Clara was not someone who was deterred by difficulty. Noah had a conversation with Clara one autumn evening that Mamie was not present for. She learned about it afterward from Clara herself, who came to her with a directness that was entirely characteristic. "Noah offered to help with the schooling costs," Clara said. Mamie looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said I would accept a loan, not a gift, and that I would repay every dollar once I had a position. He said that was fine." Clara paused. "It is fine, isn't it? I should have asked you first." "It is more than fine," Mamie said. Clara left for Emporia in January of 1886, and the homestead was quieter without her in a way that was ache and pride in equal measure. She wrote letters regularly, detailed and observant letters that Mamie saved in the box where she kept the important things. June, who was 15 by then, took the extra space with characteristic June energy. She was out at the horse pen at every possible opportunity, and Noah had long since stopped pretending he was going to keep her away from it. She had a talent that was genuine and obvious, and he taught her what he knew, and she absorbed it with the same total commitment she brought to everything. James was walking and then running and then climbing things that were not designed to be climbed, and his laughter had become the sound that the house was built around, that warm, full-throated baby laugh that grew into a toddler laugh, and then a small boy laugh, and Noah chased him around the yard in the evenings and caught him and lifted him up and made the world seem entirely right. In the winter of 1886, Mamie told Noah they were expecting again. This time she told him the same evening she was sure, and he held her and said her name in the same careful way, and she laughed and told him he was going to have to find a new reaction eventually, and he said no, he was not. Their daughter was born in July of 1887, in the middle of a hot afternoon, and they named her Rose, and she was from the first moment a person of absolute opinions and enormous charm. James, who was 3.5, regarded her with initial suspicion and then total devotion, and was found on 3 separate occasions attempting to give her objects she could not yet hold, including a smooth stone June had given him and a spoon and one of the cats. In 1888, Clara came home for the summer with her teaching certificate, and with the news that she had been offered a position at a school in a small town in the western part of the state. She was 20 years old, and she sat at the supper table and told them about it with a composure that barely contained the excitement underneath it. And Mamie looked at this person who had been 12 years old and pressed into her side at 2 graves and felt something move in her chest that was almost too large to hold. "I am so proud of you," Mamie said, and her voice was not entirely steady. Clara reached across the table and took her hand. "You did this," she said. "You kept us together. You kept us going. We kept each other going," Mamie said. "You carried the most," Clara said, and she said it with the directness she brought to everything that was true, and Mamie felt Noah's hand find hers under the table. Clara went to her school in the west of the state that autumn, and she was a wonderful teacher, which surprised no one. She wrote letters home full of stories about her students, about the particular joy of watching something difficult become understood, and she visited at Christmas and in the summers, and the house was always fuller and louder and better when she was in it. June turned 18 in 1889. And by that point her reputation with horses had spread well enough that she had begun working with several of the ranches in the area in an informal capacity. A young woman who could gentle the difficult horses, and whose opinion on any 4-legged matter was respected by men twice her age. It was not the conventional path, and Mamie had moments of worrying about it, but Noah said very simply, "She is doing what she is meant to do." And when Mamie watched June with a horse, she knew he was right. June also met a young man named Thomas Adler that same year, a horse rancher's son who had the good sense to recognize what he had in June's attention and the better sense to be worthy of it. He was respectful and honest, and June was happy in the particular way she had always been happy, fully, without reservation, with her whole bright self, and Mamie liked him on his 3rd visit and trusted him on his 5th. Noah's horse operation had by then expanded into something that could be called a real business. He had a reputation in the territory for horses that were well trained and sound, and he had taken on a hand named Bert who was reliable and hardworking, and who ate supper at their table often enough that James had stopped noticing his presence and started treating him as a given. The homestead that had been barely holding 2 years before Mamie met Noah was, by 1890, a going concern, not wealthy by any broad measure, but solid, sustained, and growing. The roof did not leak. The fence lines were maintained. The garden produced beyond their own needs, and the surplus went to market. The house had a new room added on the western side to accommodate the children. The barn was large and well kept. On a September evening in 1890, Mamie sat on the porch she had sat on for 8 years and watched the light go gold and amber across the Kansas plain. James was 7 and inside doing his letters. Rose was 3 and had fallen asleep in the yard in the direct way of very small people who reach the end of their energy without warning, and Noah had picked her up and carried her in with a tenderness that Mamie had never stopped finding beautiful. Noah came back out and sat beside her, and they sat together in the evening air the way they had sat together on the night of their wedding, comfortable and full, shoulder to shoulder. "Mamie," he said. "Yes." "I have been thinking," she waited. "The Harmon property, the 30 acres to the east that borders ours, old Harmon's place, he's been talking about selling. He has. I had a conversation with him yesterday." She turned to look at him. "Noah, the price is reasonable. With what we have in the bank and the income from the next season, you want to expand." "I want us to expand," he said, and his eyes were bright with it. We could put the south section into new pasture for the horses. It would double the training operation within 2 years. She looked at him, at the man who had walked into her life carrying her grain sacks and had quietly, persistently, lovingly helped build it into something she had not known she was allowed to want. "We have the money," she asked. "We do if we're careful." "When are we not careful?" he smiled. "Never," he said. She looked out at the land, their land, her parents' land, the land beneath which her parents rested, the land where her children played and her sisters had grown up and her life had become what it was. "All right," she said. He turned to look at her. "Let's buy it," she said. He took her hand. They expanded. The 30 acres came into their ownership in October of 1890, and the following spring they ran it the way Noah had described. And within 18 months, the horse operation had grown to a point where Bert was no longer enough help, and they brought on a second hand named Cleo, a quiet young man from a farming family 3 counties over who was good with animals and kept to himself, and was grateful for steady work. The winter of 1891 brought a letter from Clara announcing that she had met someone, a school teacher from the next county named Robert Marsh, who she described in Clara's characteristic precise terms as intelligent, kind, not foolish about himself, and good company. She came home at Christmas and brought him, and the dining table was loud and full and wonderful, and Robert Marsh survived Clara's introduction to the family with a dignity that told Mamie everything she needed to know about him. They were married the following autumn, in the same little white church where Mamie and Noah had been married 9 years before, and Clara wore their mother's dress, taken in at the waist by Mamie's own hands, and Mamie sat in the first pew between Noah and June, and felt the presence of her parents so strongly that for a moment she was certain they were there. Later, after the celebration, standing at the edge of the evening with Noah's arm around her, she told him what she had felt. "They are here," he said with complete simplicity. "Of course they are." She leaned against him. "We did all right," she said. "I think we did all right by them." "You did," he said. "You held this family together when it had every reason to fall apart, and you gave them something real, all of them." "We," she said. "We did." He pressed his lips to her hair. "We," he agreed. James was growing into a boy who was thoughtful and stubborn and funny, with Noah's steadiness and Mamie's directness, and some quality entirely his own that expressed itself in a fascination with how things worked. He was constantly taking apart and reassembling the objects available to him, which had caused some difficulty with certain household items, but which Noah had channeled into a productive apprenticeship in the workings of the horse operations equipment, and James had a natural mechanical aptitude that everyone recognized. Rose was something else entirely. Rose was warm and decisive and full of opinions that she expressed without the slightest uncertainty, which at 4 and 5 and 6 was charming, and at 7 began to be instructive. She adored her brother with a sibling love that expressed itself primarily in following him everywhere and occasionally correcting his methods, and she adored her father with a wholehearted devotion that was mutual, and which Noah clearly found both amusing and deeply moving. She also, from a very young age, loved the horses with the same instinct that June had had, and June, when she visited, recognized it immediately and said so. "She has it," June told Mamie, watching 6-year-old Rose standing completely still in front of one of the new horses that was still uncertain around people. "The way to be with them, you can't teach that." "I know," Mamie said. "What are you going to do about it?" "Let her," Mamie said. "What else would I do?" June grinned at her. "When did you get so easy about things?" "I have always been easy about things," Mamie said. June's laugh rang out over the yard, bright and full, and it was so purely June that Mamie felt a rush of love for her so sharp it was almost pain. June married Thomas Adler in the spring of 1893 at the Adler family ranch, in a ceremony that was big and warm and full of horses, which was appropriate. She was 22. She was glowing. Thomas looked at her with an expression that Mamie recognized because she had seen it on Noah's face, That particular look of a man who cannot quite believe his luck and is determined to deserve it anyway. Mamie danced at that wedding until her feet ached, and Noah danced with her, and they were not graceful, but they were real, and it was perfect. The spring of 1893 also brought the news that Clara was expecting, which arrived by letter with Clara's particular composed joy written between every line. The following winter, Clara had a son they named Daniel, and the generation turned, and the family became something with more branches than Mamie had dared imagine in those 2 years when she had been holding it together alone. In 1894, Mamie turned 35. She did not make much of this. She was not a woman who made much of birthdays. Noah made much of it. He arranged, with Clara's help via letters and June's help in person, a gathering at the homestead that brought together everyone who mattered, Clara and Robert with little Daniel, now almost a year old, June and Thomas, who arrived the night before and stayed in the expanded house without difficulty, Bert and his new wife, Mary, the Carlyles from town, Mrs. Prentice, older now but still herself with her husband. There was a long table in the yard, and there was more food than could be accounted for by any single contributor, and the afternoon was warm and golden, and the kind of afternoon that holds still for you. Noah stood and said something that Mamie would carry with her for the rest of her life. He said it simply and directly, looking at her across the table. 12 years ago, he said, I watched a woman try to carry 3 grain sacks across the main street of Caldwell by herself, and when I offered to help she looked at me like I might be planning something. I was not planning anything. I had no plan at all. I just thought that she should not have to carry all of that alone. He paused. I was right about that, and she has let me help carry it ever since. I am grateful every day of my life for that. Mamie was not someone who cried easily in front of people. She had trained herself out of it in the 2 years of managing alone when there had not been room for it. But she felt her eyes go bright and she did not look away from him. Thank you, she said, and she meant it in the way that thanked him for everything, for all of it. For 12 years of steadiness and love and shared work and the grain sacks and the wagon wheel and the fence posts and the tax assessment and the porch evenings and the children and all the days between. He understood. He nodded and sat down and took her hand under the table. The afternoon went on around them, loud and warm and full. James was 11 and sat at the table with the focused attention of a boy taking in information he intends to use. Rose was 8 and was currently engaged in showing baby Daniel something in her cupped hands that Daniel was finding fascinating. Clara was watching this with an expression of maternal alertness that was so perfectly Clara that Mamie had to smile. June was laughing at something Thomas had said. Noah was talking to Robert about the eastern pasture expansion. Bert was telling Mrs. Prentice a story about a horse that had gotten into the supply shed, and Mrs. Prentice was laughing with her whole self. Mamie sat in the middle of all of it and looked at each of them in turn, and she thought about the woman she had been at 23 with bleeding hands and 3 grain sacks in the middle of a dusty street in Caldwell, Kansas, with 2 sisters who needed her, and a homestead falling behind, and a weight that had settled on her with the efficiency of something that intended to stay. She thought about what she had not known then that she knew now. She had not known that carrying things alone was not the same as strength. That allowing someone to carry things beside you was its own kind of strength, maybe the harder kind, the kind that required trust, which required being willing to be seen, which required believing that you deserved help. She had not known that the life she was protecting so fiercely was large enough to hold more than she could see from where she was standing. She had not known that a man in a weather-worn hat crossing a dusty street could be the thing that changed the shape of everything. She knew it now. The evening came in the way evenings did over the Kansas plain, gradually and then all at once, the light going from gold to amber to the soft deep purple that preceded dark, and the stars beginning to appear above the land that was hers and Noah's and had been her parents' before that. The guests went home in good order, with embraces and good wishes and the gentle chaos of gathering children and wraps, and the last pieces of pie pressed on them as they left. Clara and Robert stayed the night, and June and Thomas, and the house was full in the way it had been full on those early years, every room occupied, every voice somewhere in the sound of home. Later, when the house had gone quiet and the children were asleep and Clara and Robert had gone to their room and June and Thomas to theirs, Mamie and Noah stood at the kitchen door and looked out at the night together. The land lay quiet under the stars, familiar and real, the barns and the fences and the garden and the horse pen and the acres to the east that they had added to what was theirs. "Noah," she said. "Yes. Are you happy?" He turned to look at her. "Mamie," he said, and his voice was full of something that did not need many words. "I came to Caldwell with a string of horses and no particular plan. I am standing in my own home with my wife beside me and my children asleep inside and my family under my roof. What do you think?" "I think yes," she said. "Yes," he agreed. He put his arm around her. "Are you?" She considered the question with the seriousness she brought to true things. She thought about the 2 years before Noah. The morning she had woken before dawn and stood at the cold stove and understood that there was no one coming to help, that everything depended on her and gone forward anyway. She thought about the pride of that, the real fierce pride of it, and also the cost, the loneliness that had lived inside the competence like a stone inside a fist. She thought about the Tuesday afternoon when a tall man with a weather-worn hat had crossed a street and said, very simply, "Let me help you carry that." She thought about grain sacks and wagon wheels and fence posts and rain-soaked roofs and tax assessments and porch evenings and 2 children asleep inside and 2 sisters building their own full lives in the world she had held together for them. She thought about what it felt like to be known, to be seen, to have someone decide, with no particular drama and no hidden agenda, just a steady and enduring love, that they were going to stay. "Yes," she said. She leaned into him and his arm tightened around her, and they stood there together under the enormous Kansas sky, on the land where she had buried her parents and raised her sisters and fallen in love and built a life that was good and real and theirs. The stars were very bright. The night was warm. Somewhere in the house, a small voice, Rose's voice, murmured something in sleep and went quiet again. Tomorrow there would be work. There would always be work. That was the nature of the life they had chosen and the land they had chosen it on. There would be seasons of abundance and seasons of strain and ordinary days and remarkable ones, and children growing and decisions to be made and the continual unfolding of a life being lived fully and in earnest. But tonight the work was done, and the people she loved were near, and the man beside her had chosen her, continued to choose her, would keep choosing her for all the days that followed this one. She thought again about what he had said at the supper table, about carrying things, about not having to carry them alone. She had not known at 23 that the bravest thing she would ever do was not the 2 years of managing alone, although that had required a real and considerable bravery. The bravest thing had been allowing someone to stand beside her, opening her hands, letting the weight be shared. "Noah," she said. "Yes," he said into the top of her head. "Thank you for not walking away when I told you I could manage." She felt him laugh low and warm against her hair. "You could manage," he said. "You were always going to manage. I just wanted to be there while you did." She held on to him under the stars and the wide dark sky, on the land that held her parents' memory and her children's future, and the whole of the life she had been brave enough to build. It was more than enough. It was everything. And somewhere beneath the quiet of the night, in the place where the hardest and truest things lived, Mamie Doyle, Mamie Fairchild, was glad beyond any words she had for it. Glad she had dropped the grain sacks. Glad he had crossed the street. Glad she had, finally, let someone help her carry it.